The best defense against terror is a global offensive against terror, wherever it might be found.
The first phase of this war was the bombing of Afghanistan. The Taliban government was quickly overthrown. The aftermath of the war was more complicated.
Our fight against terrorism began in Afghanistan, but it will not end there.
We're primarily looking at detainees that we can use. We're collecting intelligence.
Guantanamo was the first time that the techniques of the Kubark Manual were explicitly and publicly being used by American forces, officially sanctioned in the White House and openly broadcast on television around the world.
Isolation, both physical and psychological, must be maintained from the moment of apprehension. The capacity for resistance is diminished by disorientation. Prisoners should maintain silence at all times. They should never be allowed to speak to each other.
3 of the prisoners were Asif Iqbal, Ruhal Ahmed and Shafiq Rasool from Tipton in England. They spent more than 2 years in Guantanamo before being released without charge.
Mentally, yeah, you couldn't speak to nobody, you couldn't do nothing, you couldn't stand up. And just sitting there, you'd be in your thoughts all the time thinking, what the hell's going on, where the hell am I? And we're going to be staying here for the rest of our lives, and we're going to be going back home. Will we ever see our family again?
Of the 779 prisoners that have been held in Guantanamo Bay, only 3 have ever been convicted of any offence.
Well, the only thing I know for certain is that these are bad people.
It was a message to the whole world, and the message was clear. It was, this is what happens to you if you get in our way.
The war on terror is not about one man, and it is not about one country.
There were many justifications given for the invasion of Iraq. But if the US had really wanted to attack a country where the leaders of Al-Qaeda were thought to be hiding, which had nuclear weapons and was selling nuclear technology to other countries, then Pakistan would have been the obvious choice. It had close connections to the Taliban and was being run by a military dictator. Instead, George Bush chose to target Iraq, a country with the 3rd largest oil reserves in the world.
Now, about the Defense Department's war plan. It is not like that for the Gulf War. It's more along the lines of the Panama invasion of 1989. CBS News has been told it would start on what's called A-Day. A as in airstrikes. Airstrikes so devastating, they would leave Saddam's soldiers unable or unwilling to fight. The idea is to rain down the thunder so hard as to create, quote, shock and awe.
If the Pentagon sticks to its current war plan, one day in March, the Air Force and Navy will launch between 300 and 400 cruise missiles at targets in Iraq. More than were launched during the entire 40 days of the first Gulf War. The sheer size of this has never been seen before, never been contemplated before. Harlan Ullman is one of the authors of the shock and awe concept, which relies on large numbers of precision-guided weapons.
So that you have this simultaneous effect, rather like the nuclear weapons at Hiroshima, not taking days or weeks, but in minutes. You also take the city down. By that I mean you get rid of their power, their water, and you begin this relentless campaign to wear them down so that 2, 3, 4, 5 days they are physically, emotionally, and psychologically exhausted.
Last night, a square mile in central Baghdad seemed like hell on earth.
During the first wave of the bombing, the citizens of Baghdad suffered a version of the sensory deprivation described in the Kubark Manual. In the chaos that followed the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, the US did little to stop the looting. Some US officials even thought it gave them a head start on dismantling the Iraqi state. John Agresto, Director of Higher Education Reconstruction, said he saw the looting of schools as the opportunity for a clean start. In fact, before sanctions, Iraq had the best education system in the region. 89% of Iraqis were literate. By contrast, in New Mexico, John Agresto's home state, 46% of the population were functionally illiterate.
Iraq, you had three distinct forms of shock that were all working together and reinforcing each other. You had the shock of the war, which was immediately followed by economic shock therapy imposed under Paul Bremer. And as resistance to that economic transformation, that very rapid economic shock grew, you had the shock of enforcement, including torture. Three different kinds of shock.
In May 2003, Paul Bremer was appointed US envoy to Iraq. 2 weeks after he arrived, he declared the country open for business.
We considered that the coalition had very broad authorities to determine the direction of the Iraqi economy.
Bremer knew little of Iraq, but he knew about disaster capitalism. He had launched crisis consulting practice at the start of the Homeland Security boom.
Today is a very important day in Baghdad.
Bremer spent the first 4 months passing classic Chicago school laws. Rumsfeld described Iraq as having some of the most enlightened and inviting tax and investment laws in the free world. One of the first acts of Bremer was to fire 500,000 state workers. This was partly an act of debartification, but slashing governments was also vintage Friedman. Money was promised for reconstruction.
Our investment in the future of Afghanistan and Iraq is the greatest commitment of its kind since the Marshall Plan.
But in fact, it was just the opposite. Whereas the Marshall Plan was intended to boost European industries, US aid money in Iraq was spent on US corporations. If work came to Iraqis, it came at the bottom of a series of subcontractors. Creative associates received contracts worth $100 million to draft the curriculum and print new textbooks for the education system. Management and technology consultant Bearing Point was awarded contracts worth $240 million to build a market-driven system in Iraq. North Carolina-based RTI received contracts worth $466 million to advise on bringing democracy to Iraq. And Halliburton was awarded $20 billion in cost-plus Iraqi contracts. Parsons was handed $186 million to build 142 health clinics. Only 6 were ever completed. And basic electricity and water supplies hardly improved, despite billions being spent in the first 4 years.
We're going to succeed here, and when we succeed here, we will have done something important, not just for 25 million Iraqis. We will have done something that serves Western interests in this whole region.
Even the new Iraqi currency was printed abroad.
Let me show you an example of these notes.
The US even paid private contractors to monitor the work of the private contractors who won contracts.
I was in Baghdad in 2004, and this is the period when bombs started to go off regularly in Baghdad. In fact, the night that I arrived, a bomb went off very near our hotel. But what was really striking to me in this period was that despite the violence and despite the chaos, the next day, Iraqis were out in the streets protesting. 19 killed and 100 injured in Najaf. And what they were demanding at this time was elections, the right to actually have a say in what the post-Saddam era would look like. Now, in the early days of the occupation, the protests were peaceful, but as time went on, and the protests didn't have an effect, more and more Iraqis joined the armed resistance.
The violence spun out of control. As in South America 3 decades earlier, bodies were often dumped by the roadside as a warning to others. These were Iraq's disappeared. Extremely aggressive measures were needed to suppress the opposition. The first 3.5 years of the occupation, 61,500 Iraqis were captured. By spring 2007, 19,000 remained in custody. In prison, they were interrogated using techniques that could be traced to those devised by the CIA from Ewan Cameron's experiments in the 50s. According to the Red Cross, US military officials admitted that between 70 and 90% of arrests in Iraq were mistakes. The chaos in Iraq seems like a defeat for shock therapy. But in Iraq, disaster capitalism moved on. Now the disaster itself provided the opportunity for profit. US military spending has almost doubled since 2001, nearing $700 billion per year. As long ago as 1961, President Eisenhower, not a noted liberal, warned of the danger of a too powerful military.
Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
The war in Iraq is the most privatized war in modern history. The Green Zone in Baghdad is an extreme version of what is happening around the world. A privatized, secure world protected from the chaos outside. In 1991, in the First Gulf War, for every 100 soldiers, there was one military contractor. In 2003, at the beginning of the war in Iraq, for every 100 soldiers, there were 10 contractors. By 2006, for every 100 soldiers, there were 33 contractors. A year later, for every 100 soldiers, there were 70 contractors. By July 2007, there were more contractors than soldiers in Iraq. This was going beyond what even Milton Friedman had dared to hope.
The only things I would not denationalize are the armed forces, the courts, and some of your roads and highways.
One of the most high-profile contractors was Blackwater USA. During the April 2004 uprising in Najaf, Blackwater assumed command over US Marines. Dozens of Iraqis were killed during the operation. The US had indemnified the private contractors against any Iraqi laws, so they were operating in a law-free bubble, a little like Guantanamo.
I asked your Secretary of Defense a couple months ago what law governs their actions. Mr.
I was going to ask him. Go ahead.
Help. Well, I was